What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I'm going to be going over some helpful tips and tricks that you should know going into Reset. When this video is live, it will be the day before Grandmaster's release, and I wanted to talk about some cool interactions that you may not know about. I had originally made this video on Wednesday night, and then Bungie dropped some patch notes on Thursday morning that made me have to redo the entire video. I talked about how Malfeasance could double as both an overload and unstoppable weapon, but sadly, Bungie put an end to that fun. Another thing that Bungie patched was Le Monarch working with Piercing Bowstring. It has intrinsic overload, so like Malfeasance, it was able to double dip. So that is where the first perk interactions come into play that I want to talk about. Weapons cannot have dual champion stunning capability, or so Bungie wants you to believe. I won't go over every example here, but I wanted to show some interactions that will be helpful to you when you are selecting your loadouts for Grandmasters. So I went into the Nightfall this week and I had Overload Machine Gun on. I proc Volatile rounds, which is supposed to give Void Weapons anti-barrier capability, but as you can see, Le Monarch and my Void Machine Gun are both unable to stun the barrier champion despite Volatile rounds being active. I then head back into the Nightfall with Overload Machine Gun off, and you can see I proc anti-barrier rounds with Volatile and rip through the barrier shield. So this is quite important to know. And that brings me to the next interaction, which works counter to this. First, we'll start with Volt Shot. I have an anti-barrier auto rifle with Volt Shot. Volt Shot applies Jolt, which can stun Overload champions. And as you can see in the background footage, the Volt Shot application is able to stun the Overload despite also having anti-barrier rounds for dealing with barrier champs. So it actually is possible to have dual functionality. It just depends on the application. I will not go over every example because there are far too many to test. I will just ask you, the viewer, to leave other interactions in the comments of what works and what doesn't so we can all learn together and have the most flexible loadouts possible. So I have shown you an example of where you can't have two anti-champion stunning perks and one where you can. And now for the weirdest one where you can have both. Here I have a Chill Clip fusion rifle, and Chill Clip applies slows to enemies. This can stun Overload champions. It can also freeze, which stuns Unstops, but we already have Unstoppable Fusion this season. So with Unstoppable Fusion Rifle on, amazingly, I'm able to stun the Overload champ with my slow. However, if you ADS too long to get the Unstoppable shot, then the slow application will not stun the Overload. So this is a sometimes works. My advice would be to hipfire to get a more consistent stun. Chill Clip isn't the best for keeping Overloads stunned and from regenning their health. It is really only good for just getting the initial stun. After my testing, it seems it only stuns on the initial application of the slow. So if the Overload comes out of stun and still has slow applied to it, additional slow will not stun the champion, even if its cooldown has expired. Once the slow wears off, you are able to restun the champ. This isn't ideal as you want to keep applying slow to the champ so it doesn't regen health, but if you do that, then you won't be able to restun it. So just something useful to know. You have to play around with this perk to get used to the timing, but my advice, at least for fusion rifles, is to only use it for initial stunning. And make sure not to ADS if you have Unstoppable Fusion Rifle equipped. I just wanted to point out this interaction to prove it can both work and not work so long as you know what you're doing. Speaking of Overload champs, I wanted to talk about Overload Hand Cannon. First, in the background gameplay, you can see I have Malfeasance on. I do have Overload Hand Cannon on as well, but as you can see, it is not getting the stun. So unfortunately, Bungie's patch worked. The next thing with Overload Hand Cannon I want to talk about though is Payload Perks. We all know Overloads can be annoying. Overload captains teleport constantly and Minotaurs do too, but Payload Perks can stun in fewer shots. Explosive Payload and Time Payload are great against Overload champions, specifically on 180 RPM hand cannons because they shoot faster so they can proc the Overload shot quicker. Here I have a Fatebringer, and with Explosive Payload I can get the Overload shot to proc more frequently because the game counts the explosion as a second shot. I've always found Time Payload to be even better, proccing in just 2 shots extremely consistently. I can't recommend the 7th Seraph Officer Revolver enough because it's a 180, and the Cantata is another good hand cannon that can roll Time Payload, except these 2 hand cannons are extremely hard to farm, if not impossible, but if you have them with Time Payload sitting in your vault, bust them out. I know we have countless ways of dealing with champs these days, but these weapons are great and hand cannons are in a good place in PvE right now. And speaking of Overload Hand Cannon Artifact mod, I want to go over some artifact mods and things you may not know. So in the video I made before, I specifically showed off Scout Rifles because at the end of its perk description it says Scout Rifles are always overcharged when that modifier is active. This means if you have Unstoppable Scout Rifle on, it will always deal 25% more damage. This even works on exotic weapons like the Skyburner's Oath in the background gameplay. But other anti-champion weapon mods don't have the same perk description. But even though they don't state it in the description, it still works. I tested it, and as long as you have an anti-champion mod, the weapon will get the 25% buff even if it doesn't match the surge of the activity. That is very helpful to know because it means if you have a weapon you really like, say the Commemoration machine gun, but the surge is Strand and Arc, then you can still get it and get the 25% weapon boost as long as you have Overload machine gun. The Overload machine gun and hand cannon perks do not state that they get overcharged, but again, from my testing, they definitely do. So that's just another good thing to know. Additionally, you can run the Origin Perk Specialization 2 mod, which overcharges weapons with certain Origin traits. So just another way to buff your favorite weapons. And speaking of weapon buffs, did you know that if you match your subclass element to the surge that it will buff your kinetic weapon damage? So the surges this season have varied between Arc, Solar, and Strand, but Strand has been a surge for every Nightfall thus far. So you could run Strand in your top slot and always get that 25% buff, but if you run a stasis weapon, you are greatly hindering your damage. So try to stick to kinetic or Strand weapons. You can see in the background gameplay, I am shooting enemies with a stasis adaptive pulse and a kinetic adaptive pulse, and the kinetic deals way more damage. So avoid stasis unless it is a seasonal artifact weapon. So for example, Riptide has Unstoppable Fusion Rifle, so it will get the 25% damage increase thanks to it being overcharged from the artifact. And that is really all the tips I have for champion interactions. On screen now are some infographics I made of different ways to intrinsically stun champions. I made them in April, so they're not fully up to date, but they give a pretty good idea of what things can intrinsically stun all types of champions. But it is missing weapons like Wicked Implement because they came out more recently. And speaking of Wicked Implement, it is able to apply slow to overloads which can stun them, and it can have Unstoppable Scout Rifle to deal with unstops. So it's honestly a monster this season. However, 5 of the 6 GMs do not have overloads, but keep this weapon in mind in the future if Anti-Barrier Scout comes back around. It's got great double dipping functionality, so let's hope this doesn't get nerfed one day also. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just some general loadout suggestions in the Grandmasters themselves. We have more loadout flexibility than ever now with intrinsic stunning options tied to subclass verbs, and the ability to run basically whatever champion stunning mods we want because you don't have to match surges like I just mentioned. Just slap on an anti-champion mod and boom, 25% free damage. But I wanted to go over some superstar weapons to have in your kit. First off is the Anti-Barrier King, and that is Wish Ender. It can one-shot barrier shields in GMs, which is no joke, as Ariana's Vow can't even do that sometimes. It also triple penetrates targets, so you get massive super energy. And it can one-shot pretty much all red bars, so it is great for damage. On top of all that, with the seasonal artifact mod this season, you have Semi-Auto Striker, which can give you armor charge just for landing crits with a bow, sniper, or scout rifle, which makes even more damage if you have kinetic surge on. And also, there is Rapid Fire Ranger, which gives a 15% weaken to enemies when you land rapid precision hits. So it is even better this season than it usually is. And speaking of Semi-Auto Striker, Cloud Strike also benefits from this and Rapid Fire Ranger greatly. You want to use this in Arc Surge activities? I use it on Lightblade and it absolutely wrecked. There are good opportunities to use long-range weapons on that GM, and the AoE from the lightning strikes gives awesome ad clear, so don't sleep on Cloud Strike when Arc Surge is active. Necrochasm has great ad clear, but Quicksilver Storm in my opinion is basically just a better exotic primary auto rifle. Its grenades can also one-shot barrier shields thanks to anti-barrier auto. Witherhoard and Izanagi's Burdens are kinetic specials that benefit from that 25% bonus to kinetic weapons as long as your subclass matches a surge, so they're also great weapons to take into a Nightfall. Malfeasance with Lucky Pants still absolutely shreds, even though it can't deal with overloads anymore. Again, 5 out of the 6 GMs this season don't even have overloads, so this is a great option to run as well. I already detailed how versatile Riptide is with Chill Clip, but I will mention it again. Reservoir Burst Fusion Rifles with mag enhancing perks are great for ad clear and for dealing with unstoppable champions. Hand cannons are feeling great this season, and exotics deal 40% extra damage to red bars, so Sunshot is looking very nice. The trifecta of energy bows is also very nice. Le Monarch is still top tier for overloads, and Trinity Ghoul and Tikus can be used for anti-barrier. Vex Mythoclast is also very strong this season and can benefit from Unstoppable Fusion Rifle. In the heavy slot, machine guns are very strong these days, and we have Overload Machine Gun on the artifact to make them hit 25% harder. Commemoration is great, but any machine gun that you like can be really good. Thunderlord is nice, Lament is always fun if you know how to play with swords and GMs, Leviathan's Breath as always is excellent, and honestly, don't sleep on bipod rockets. I soloed the Moon Battlegrounds Master Nightfall with it and was extremely impressed. There are tons of other good options as well. Like I said, payload perk hand cannons are great. Auto rifles with Vorpal, Disruption Break, or Adaptive Munitions are really good to use on barrier champs. Again, we have more weapons at our disposal than ever before. I just wanted to give some insight into some cool interactions that I thought the community may find helpful as they strategize for ways to deal with this season's GMs. So far this season, we have had Lightblade with Arc and Strand Surge. This GM has barriers and unstoppables. Heist Battleground Moon, which was Solar and Strand Surge and has barriers and unstoppables. And Scarlet Keep, which is Void and Strand Surge and has barriers and unstoppables. So we have every light subclass represented. So you may have to run a variety of different builds to take full advantage of the surges this season. Devil's Lair is the lone GM that we know has overloads, and it also has barriers. Heist Battleground Moon has barriers and unstops, and Heist Battleground Europa comes out on Tuesday. In the past it had barriers and unstops, but it also does have Fallen, which means barrier servitors, but it also could potentially have overload captains. We'll have to wait and see. Anyways, that is it for the video. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, then a like and sub would be greatly appreciated. Like I mentioned earlier, feel free to leave other interesting interactions that either work or don't work down in the comments so that people can learn. I appreciate it. Lastly, if you made it this far, then thanks for watching to the end. It means a lot. Happy GM running and take care.